Hello and welcome to the 7th episode in this series on the case for God. Jim, good to see you.
Good to be here, Ollie.
It's been a really interesting weekend here in Northern Ireland because our very own Rory McIlroy is now a Grand Slam champion, career Grand Slam, winning the Masters. Did you watch a bit of that, Jim?
Yes, it was a nerve-shredding evening and late night it was too. My nerves were shot to pieces by the end. Did you watch it?
I watched it, and I too was. Yeah, it was pretty horrifying to watch him almost throw it away and then pull it back, and then almost throw it away and then pull it back. It was, yeah, he really did put us through the ringer, but quite an achievement.
There was one of the commentators put out this message saying, "If he misses this putt, I will never watch golf again."
Yeah. Oh man, it was psychologically brutal, and then just seeing all his emotions come out on the 18th green, it was it was a really historic sporting moment. So I'm glad you tuned into golf for a bit, Jim. Have you ever played golf? Are you a golfer?
No. I've played pitch and putt, but that's about it.
I feel like we should play around sometime, you and I.
Yeah, I don't know. But it was a brilliant night, I have to say. I'm amazed at the unbelievable skill that those guys have. I mean, it is astonishing to drop it, within 5 feet of the hole from 175 yards.
Yeah, amazing. It's crazy. The distance control is unbelievable. I mean, and if you do play around, you realize how good they are and how far they're hitting it. I mean, they're driving at 340 yards, and it's like, insane. But anyhow, in this episode, Jim, we're going to be looking at the moral argument. In our previous discussions, we built up a cumulative case for an eternal personal mind who lies behind the physical universe. The arguments from reason, the origin of the universe and its design, and the argument from consciousness come together to support the conclusion that there is, in fact, an uncaused, timeless, unembodied personal mind equipped with immense power who brought this universe into being. But in this episode, we're going to be thinking about the character of this eternal mind. Might he or it be malignant or good? So we'll be discussing what's called the moral argument, and it's going to bring us much closer to our personal experience, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah. I mean, the moral argument is the most visceral of all the arguments. I mean, it's not abstract. It cuts to the heart of our everyday lives. It's about good and evil, about what's right and wrong. So every day we get up, we're confronted by the moral argument. Apologists like William Lane Craig all say that it is this subject which gets most traction on university campuses. And it's obvious why that is so. I mean, to be frank, arguments over the origin of the universe don't affect my daily life. But then you walk through your campus and you see a poster which asks, is racism objectively wrong? Someone hands you a felt-tip pen and asks you to cast your vote. Now, for all of us, the instinct is to answer yes. But suddenly you realize that the question raises all sorts of really deep issues about the nature of reality. If there's nothing to us but atoms and molecules, if the whole shebang is nothing but physical stuff, then what do we mean by objective morals?
We should probably clarify those terms up front then. When we talk about objective morals, we mean they are independent of humans. So when we say that murder is wrong, we're not talking about a social norm or a convention, nor are we just expressing a personal preference against murdering other people. Objective morals, in some sense, are written into the fabric of reality. Things are right and wrong, independent of humanity.
That's right. So when we talk about moral values, we're talking about virtues like goodness and truthfulness, kindness, generosity, and so on. But philosophers recognize that there's a unique thing about morality. It's more than a set of those sorts of values. There seems to be a sort of authority behind them. In other words, morality isn't just a set of facts that we can describe. There is what's called a normative force behind them, an ought behind the is. So philosophers talk about our moral duties and our obligations. We ought not to murder. We have a duty to be generous. We are obliged to tell the truth. So in this conversation, we won't just be describing moral values like kindness and goodness. We're going to have to delve into this strange phenomenon that there are moral rules that seem to have weight. There are things that we ought to do and things we ought not to do. And we seem to have this sense that we have these moral duties and obligations.
Before we get going with the moral argument, there are a couple of preliminary points that we need to get out of the way. So one of the most common reactions to any discussion about morals is for someone to say, I can be good without God. Tell us what's going on behind that statement.
Well, I think atheists are right to be upset by anyone who claims that, atheists live shriveled, selfish and amoral lives. I mean, that is manifestly untrue. All my atheist friends love their families and they make a positive contribution to the world. I learned more about integrity in business life from an atheist than any Christian. The problem here is that there are two quite different questions being conflated. It's quite possible to be good without believing in God, but that's different from saying that we can be good without God, because if there is no God, then how can there be such a thing as the good? Now, it's going to take us a bit of time to answer all that stuff, of course, but for now, what we're saying is that the moral argument takes no cheap shots at how atheists live their lives.
The subject of morality can also lead to accusations being made against Christianity. What about the actions of the God of the Old Testament, you'll hear people say, or what about the Crusades in church history?
Well, those are important and valid questions, but we can park them for now because we're nowhere near Christianity yet in this series. We're up to number 7, aren't we, I think? But we still haven't got to Christianity. We're still making the case for classic theism. So we shall have to answer specific questions that challenge the morality of Christianity in due course. In fact, we've actually done so in previous seasons of the podcast. But those issues are irrelevant to the conversation we're going to have today, because today we're just being theists, not Christians.
The issues raised by the moral argument are wide-ranging and complex. How then shall we structure this conversation, Jim?
Right. Well, I suggest we follow the same pattern we've followed in previous episodes. So we won't attempt to deduce the existence of God from moral duties and obligations. Instead, we will make an inference to the best explanation. In other words, we're going to behave like detectives at a crime scene. We'll start with data. We will look for clues. We'll think about the reality of our moral experience in daily life. And then we'll compare the various explanations that philosophers have given to explain that experience. And I'm going to argue that theism provides the best explanation for our moral experience.
There seems to be a big dividing line in this discussion between those who believe that objective morals are real things and those who don't. How do those two camps affect the moral argument?
Okay, well, let's start with a bit of terminology. People who believe that objective morals are real things are called moral realists. Okay, so let's just remember that term. And you're quite right to say that the whole debate can be divided into two halves, because it's not just theists who are moral realists. It's not just theists who believe in objective morals. A large number of atheists, especially in academia, are also moral realists, but of course they don't believe in God. So our first task is to see if theism is the best explanation for moral realism, if theism is the best explanation for objective morals. Then, in the second half of our conversation, we will consider all the arguments put forward by people who say that morals aren't objective at all. They're merely human constructs. Perhaps they're the product of evolution, or they're just cultural norms, or even personal preference. Or maybe they're instruments of power exercised by a ruling elite. So in order to make the case for theism, I will try to show that theism is the best explanation for moral realism. That's the first half. And then secondly, I'll argue that all the attempts to reduce morals to human constructs fail. Now, if that is true, then we have a compelling case for theism.
Let's begin by thinking about our experience of morals in daily life. They represent a really curious feature of life, don't they? All of us have this sense that we have an obligation to do good and not to do evil. So we often talk about having a troubled conscience if we've hurt someone, for example. That's why we all struggle, I think, with feelings of guilt and shame, and we sometimes long to be forgiven. That seems to be a universal experience.
I think that's right, although the things we feel guilty about are not always universal. In our own culture, for instance, divorce has been largely normalized, but a century ago it was regarded as a shameful thing. So not all cultures are the same. However, the differences between cultures are nowhere near as big as some people argue. C.S. Lewis talks of a concept which he calls the Tao, and the Tao is a set of moral rules to which all cultures adhere and have adhered. He examined every major culture from the Greeks and the Romans to the ancient Eastern cultures in China, and he found a commonality across all of them. Now, some listeners may not be convinced by Lewis's argument, but we can simplify the debate by taking just a few examples. So let's ask some questions. Is genocide morally wrong? Think of the Holocaust or the ethnic cleansing in Rwanda. Were those events in history morally wrong or not? Is torturing a baby for fun morally wrong? Is it morally good to love and care for an infant, but morally wrong to abuse her? When someone mugs an innocent person on the street and then, in an act of cold malice, stabs them to death for no reason, is that morally wrong? Or go back to the example I cited earlier about racism. Was it morally wrong to force black people to sit at the back of the bus and drink from different water fountains than white people? Is racism morally wrong?
All those examples start to make us feel deeply uncomfortable, and we intuitively feel that they ought not to be done. We feel the weight of the moral imperative.
That's right. But, think when a lion kills a zebra, we wouldn't dream of accusing it of murder. But when a street mugger callously ends the life of an innocent man just for the fun of it, then we do call that murder. And the question is, why? Why do we humans feel the normative force of morals? We aren't just reacting to bad news. For example, if someone is diagnosed with cancer, that is bad. But it's not the same as in the same category as being stabbed, because there's a personal aspect to moral actions. We can discern malice or cruelty or betrayal. Moral transgression produces shame or guilt or indignation. Just think of the cries for justice down through the ages.
So it does seem then that our moral experience assumes that human lives do have some real value. So you think about how we react to slavery or ethnic cleansing. We seem to have a deep instinct within us that human persons have intrinsic value.
Yes, even those on the left of the political spectrum uphold that idea. Their support for abortion is premised on the idea that an unborn child is not a full person. Because if we all agreed that the child was a person, then no one would support abortion. Or think of the libraries full of human rights legislation. Human rights are based on the idea that all humans are equal and have innate worth. That's why we react so strongly to murder or torture. Someone hitting a rock or killing an animal for food would not generate any moral outrage.
So our moral experience in daily life shows that we share this sense that there is such a thing as good and such a thing as evil, as right and wrong. And we feel the weight of moral obligations and duties. We all experience shame and guilt when we do something that we consider to be immoral. So that's our data, if you like. Our moral experience is like the clues that a detective might examine in order to explain morality itself. How do we take that data and then develop it into an argument?
Well, the first step is to make the case for moral realism. Okay, we assert that moral values and duties are real things. They aren't just human constructs. Any of our listeners who don't believe in moral realism will have to wait until the second half of the podcast when we examine their case for moral relativism. So if you think that evolution produced our moral sense, please just be patient with me. But for now, I'm going to argue that moral values and duties are independent of humans. They are written into the fabric of reality.
So why should someone believe that?
Well, let's consider again the idea that torturing babies for fun is an objectively evil thing to do. If you saw someone do that terrible thing, would you shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's not my preference? Or would you say that the torturer is just breaking a social norm, which is all the moral weight of the offside rule in football? Would you stand at the gates of Auschwitz and say that the Holocaust wasn't really wrong, it just went against herd morality? Someone who adopts that type of cultural relativism is forced to say that in the end, a rapist is just unfashionable. So it seems to me that any right-minded person must concede that objective morals do exist. If you seriously think that child rape is just a personal preference or the breaking of a social convention, then I have nothing to say to you. You should switch off this podcast and seek medical help because you're sick in the head. Trying to argue with someone like that is like trying to argue with someone who asserts that 2 + 2 = 5. The intuition that we all have that there is such a thing as good and evil, and that those moral realities transcend personal preferences, is very, very strong.
So for now, let's assume that moral realism is true. Morality is somehow written into the fabric of reality. Does that lead us inevitably then to theism?
No, it doesn't. Moral realists have two options open to them. theism or some form of Platonism. So let's think about Plato's ideas for a moment. Plato divided reality into two realms, the eternal domain and the temporal visible domain. And he then introduces this concept which he calls universals into his framework. Now, universals are abstract objects that exist in the eternal realm. In the context of ethics, we might think of universals such as justice or courage. And these universals then become instantiated many times in the visible world that we actually live in. So we encounter individual people who are just or courageous. So Plato is a moral realist. His scheme supports the idea that moral qualities are objectively real things. Justice and kindness and courage are not human artifacts. Now, quite a number of atheist philosophers are in the same ballpark as Plato. I mean, they may not go for his universals, but they are moral realists. They say that things like truthfulness and kindness are just brute facts in the world that we can't explain. We just accept them. Now, there are two big problems with Platonism. In his world, moral values just float around somewhere in some eternal domain, or else they're just brute facts. But if that was so, why should we feel the weight of moral duties and obligations? How do we get from is to ought? We've already seen that a central characteristic of morality is that we ought to do certain things and ought not to do others. But Plato's abstract objects can't tell us what we ought to do. They have no normative force. They just are. That's the first big problem. The second big problem is about how we might come to know moral truths. If we're just physical creatures plodding around in the dust of this physical world, how could we possibly come to know these abstract things as they float in some eternal domain? So it seems to me that the best explanation for moral realism is theism. The theist says that we need an objective reference point by which we evaluate moral decisions. God's character is the standard against which all our actions are measured. And that, I need to say something here, because some non-Christians have a really distorted view of God. They see him as a big, powerful tyrant. But theists say that God is the source of all that is just and truthful and loving and kind. God has expressed his nature to us as commands, and it is those commands which carry the weight of duties and obligations. Think of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. So moral obligations press themselves upon us as a sort of law. And that experience makes sense under theism because we now have a lawgiver. Okay, so duties such as loving our neighbour or helping the poor carry this sense of bindingness that goes beyond social contracts or self-interest. And those duties aren't arbitrary things because they flow from the essential nature of God.
So you're saying that as a personal holy being, God issues commands that ground our obligations. And unlike Platonism, a divine commander can sustain such obligations.
That's right. Theism also answers the second objection to Plato's model, because under theism we have a reliable way to come to know moral values. Theism says that our moral knowledge is best explained by a purposeful design from a moral lawgiver. The God who encoded morality into reality is the same God who designed the human conscience and reason, so they can align with the external moral order, allowing each of us to discern right from wrong. Without God, our moral intuitions would be inexplicable or illusory. Yet the truth is that they consistently guide us towards objective virtues like justice and love.
So we've got to the conclusion that if moral realism is true, then theism is the best explanation for objective morality. But some of our listeners may have been waiting patiently because they aren't moral realists. They think morality is a thing which humans have constructed over a long time. What are the options for people who take that view?
Well, let's look at the possible answers to the question, why is murder wrong? We might say, as a first explanation, murder? Yuck, what a disgusting idea. Now, that answer isn't exactly rational. All I've done is express an emotional reaction. But some very serious philosophers have argued that morality is just that. Morality just reduces to a set of emotional reactions. David Hume argued for this position. But he saw clearly that it reduced morality to personal preference. So he had to include this fudge factor in his theory. He called it social utility. He thought that groups of people would come together to agree social norms. But that idea is completely contradicted by his basic idea, his individualistic relativist approach to morality. Because if morality reduces to my personal feelings, why on earth should I think that large groups of people would come together to agree social norms? So Hume's emotivism, I don't think, works. A second option might be to say, well, let's reason this out. If I murdered someone, then someone else could murder me. In fact, everything could become chaotic. So the rational thing to do is to do to others what I'd like them to do to me. Therefore, I should not murder. Immanuel Kant based his ethics on human reason like that. In fact, he basically deified human reason. But he assumed that all of us can reason our way to ethical duties, and that's clearly not true. And his system produced this really rigid, unworkable scheme. So I'll give you an example. Suppose you were living in Nazi-occupied France, okay, during the Second World War, and you're sheltering a group of Jewish children. And an SS officer knocks on your door and asks if you are sheltering any Jews. Now, according to Kant's system, he would require you to say yes. And that's because his system ignored the consequences of our moral decisions. So ethics cannot be derived from reason alone. So let's think about a third option. A few hundred years ago, another answer was really popular. Murder is wrong because of the consequences that flow from such an action. I mean, think of the pain and the hurt that is caused by murder. And according to this moral theory, we should maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Therefore, murder is wrong. This thing called utilitarianism. Now, I think it's important to consider the consequences of an action. Of course it is. It should be part of any ethical system. But we're talking here about trying to construct a solution to all aspects of morality, and here consequentialism fails. If we only ever try to maximize the good, then why not kill an organ donor so that 5 people can benefit from his organs? Right? Why not avoid a riot by appeasing the mob with the execution of an innocent person? Why not enslave a small group of people if it increases the happiness of a larger group of people? So you see, consequentialism doesn't work either.
There are 2 other possible explanations for morality. The first one is a thing called cultural relativism. And according to this theory, moral rules develop over time in different cultures. What we have been calling morals are in fact nothing more than social norms. So it makes sense for a healthy society to prohibit murder. But that prohibition is just a human construction, nothing more.
Well, there are 2 obvious problems with that idea. First, who adjudicates between different cultures? I mean, let's remember that not long ago, the most educated, erudite culture in history decided that it was morally acceptable to murder 6 million Jews. We shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking them to be monsters or sociopaths. The Holocaust was carried out by ordinary people. They had bought into the idea that life is a survival game, and so the weak and bad members of the human race needed to be weeded out. Now, the cultural relativist has no basis on which to condemn the actions of Germany at that time. A culture evolved a set of rules that worked for them. So that's the first big problem with cultural relativism. Who adjudicates between cultures? Why did the British have the right to say that bride burning in India was objectively wrong? Why can we condemn the ritual sacrificing of tens of thousands of innocents in Aztec culture? There's a second reason why cultural relativism doesn't work as a basis for morality. Think about the description you gave of it just now, Ollie. You said that moral rules develop over time. So at some stage in history, Ugg the caveman, in a flash of moral insight, decided that killing each other with clubs was not a good way for society to develop. So he puts his idea to the others around the campfire. And that makes Ugg a moral reformer. He has a new idea. Now, here's the point. How can we decide if a new idea is moral or not? Suppose today a group of doctors propose that we kill all disabled infants. Now, in years to come, if this moral novelty is accepted, it may be seen as a great step forward. But if cultural relativism is true, how can we judge it? By what standard do we measure the doctor's proposal? You see the point? So, for both reasons, cultural relativism doesn't work.
We've left the most impressive argument to the end, and it's the idea that morals are a product of evolution. Can you explain to us how this works?
Yeah, to be more precise, the idea comes from sociobiology. Sociobiology is derived from the insight that evolutionary advantage is conferred as much by behaviour as by physique. And one particular form of behaviour, social cooperation, is an effective survival method. In the animal kingdom, so-called kin selection occurs because close relatives share the same units of heredity. So even a sterile ant will devote its life to the survival of its kin. Now, the most famous advocate for this theory is the philosopher Michael Ruse, who died recently. And Ruse proposes 3 sociobiological mechanisms. He says that some behaviours are hardwired into our brains. Some are negotiating techniques that intelligent mammals learn. And some are strategies that have been encoded into our genes. Now, the key thing to note here is that these strategies present themselves to our consciousness as rules of moral conduct. So I'm going to put this in crude terms. These evolutionary mechanisms have fooled us into thinking that survival techniques are in fact transcendent moral values. So that is his big idea. We have been programmed into thinking that morals are universal principles that are independent of us. We really believe that they are objective, but in fact, they're nothing more than survival techniques.
And how would a theist go about critiquing Michael Ruse's theory?
Well, the first thing to say is that it reduces morals to completely arbitrary survival techniques. And Ruse cheerfully admits that, and here's the key thought experiment, if we reran the evolutionary process again, then a completely different set of morals might emerge. Rape may be seen as a good thing in the second run of the process. So think again about the examples I gave earlier. The genocide in Rwanda, torturing a disabled baby for fun, stabbing someone in the street out of sheer malice, forcing black people into slavery. If Ruse is right, then we have been fooled into thinking that these actions are objectively evil. But in reality, we've just been manipulated into believing a lie. So in reality, those actions are not evil. Now think where that takes your worldview. Human life has no intrinsic value. Our appreciation of love and kindness are just illusions foisted on us by evolution. So the whole thing is a fiction. Now, there are other very good reasons why the sociobiological evolution of morals doesn't work, but that is the main one.
So we've thought about the 5 main challenges to moral realism: the emotivism of David Hume, the rationalism of Kant, consequentialism, cultural relativism, and evolutionary theory. We have good reasons to conclude that all 5 fail, and that brings us back to moral realism. Morals are not just human constructs or personal preferences. Morality is encoded into the fabric of reality. And the best explanation for moral realism is theism. Moral values are an expression of God's character, and moral duties come from a divine lawgiver.
I think that logic is compelling, Ollie. The earlier arguments we went through in this series gave us good grounds for believing in an eternal, unembodied, personal and rational mind. But now we know something about this being's character. He is all good. He is the source of love and kindness and truth and justice. The one who encoded morality into reality is the same person who designed the human conscience and reason, so they can align with the external moral order, allowing us to discern right from wrong. Now, I said at the start of this conversation that the moral argument is visceral and personal, and so I want to finish with a more pastoral argument. There's a danger that we reduce the whole moral conversation to, values and duties and obligations. But in the real world, the moral question is much wider than that. If I had to sum up the wider view that I'm thinking about here, and I had to sum it up in a word, it would be the word grace. All of us have experienced shame and guilt. There are moments in our lives for which we long to be forgiven and cleansed. Nearly all of us know that feeling of regret and longing to be a better person, to be changed, to be delivered from the character flaws, the demons that haunt us. Sometimes we catch this glimpse of how we might be if we had been perfected. Now, it seems to me that only theism can offer any hope to this wider question. Plato's universals aren't going to forgive you. David Hume's emotivism isn't going to change you. It's not going to remove your shame and guilt. Michael Ruse's sociobiological ideas will never change you. Now, I know I'm straying into Christian theism here, but the real moral argument is a story that includes forgiveness and cleansing and hope. And as we shall see in later episodes, it is utterly compelling.
Absolutely. On our next episode, Jim, we'll be considering the ontological argument. And I do sort of hesitate here to ask, but is there another piece of music that you're keen to close out with?
Yes, I have. I mean, some years ago, I came across a version of Amazing Grace sung by a 7-year-old child. Now, I could be accused here of being cheesy and sentimental, but probably I am. But there's an innocence to the thing I find very appealing, and it explains the moral argument far better than any words of ours.